Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Henson and I am the Reading and Literacy Development Manager here at State Library Victoria. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the Policy Pitch. This seminar is held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders and to the elders of other communities who may be here this evening. I'd like to give a warm welcome to tonight's speakers, Grattan Institute members and staff, and friends of the library. I'd like to thank you all for coming along. Tonight, we will hear about engaging students by creating better classroom environments for learning. A recent Grattan Institute report written by Dr. Peter Goss, our moderator this evening, highlights the fact that 40% of Australian school students are unproductive in a given year. The report calls for comprehensive reform to tackle widespread student disengagement in class. 3 experienced educational specialists, Linda Graham, Irene Iliadis and Jerome Holloman, will join Pete Goss this evening. They will explore what's happening in our classrooms, how to create better classroom environments for learning, and policy changes that would help schools to do this. Here at the library, we believe that this research and thinking is extremely important, and we are very pleased to partner with Grattan Institute to encourage our communities to think about policies to improve education. The State Library has also partnered with the Koshland Innovation Fund. We are hosting the next Australian Learning Lecture, which will address how education needs to change in order for students to succeed and flourish. The lecture is titled The New Success: What Qualities Do Our Young People Need to Succeed in the 21st Century? And will be held at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre on Thursday the 11th of May at 6:30 p.m. It will be a great opportunity for you to hear from Charles Fidel, a global education thought leader. He is the founder of the Centre for Curriculum Redesign, visiting practitioner at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, and recently authored 4-Dimensional Education. I do hope to see some of you again at the Australian Learning Lecture next week. In the meantime, I'm pleased to now introduce and welcome Dr. Peter Goss to lead tonight's conversation. Pete directs the School Education Program at Grattan Institute and has focused on how education systems and data can help schools and teachers adapt and improve their practice. Prior to joining Grattan, Pete spent more than 10 years as a strategy consultant, most recently with the Boston Consulting Group, and worked with Noel Pearson to improve education outcomes for Cape York primary school students. Please join me in welcoming Pete.
Thank you, Beck. Thank you to the State Library for hosting these events. We really value the relationship that we have. We do a number of these events each year, and it's always tremendous to have the opportunity to talk about an area in school education, the program that I run. And thanks to you all for joining us on a Tuesday night, taking some time out of your busy weeks. Hopefully avoided the rain. I caught it earlier on. It's a bit of a bleak Melbourne night. And thank you to my 3 panellists here. We're going to have a lot of fun tonight on an important and really interesting topic. At times, it's very challenging to hear some of the things that are said. As I wrote the report, I have school-aged children. I remember my own schooling. I remember not everything's always wonderful in a classroom. But as I looked at what the research said, I was quite shocked to understand just how frequent some of the challenges are, but also what the nature of the challenges are in Australia's classrooms. That the media likes to talk about classrooms out of control, and there are some, and that's horrendous. And the teachers who work in those classrooms need every support we can reasonably give them. But far more common, and the teachers themselves said far more of a challenge, were kids who were silently switching off and disengaged, or kids who were acting out a little bit and disrupting others. And as I looked more and more into this topic, I found it more fascinating because there's no simple answer to how do you engage a student. There's not even a great answer as to what does it mean to be disengaged. Some of the people that we talked about said it's just because the kids are bored. But as a parent, if you're told, I'm bored, what do you do about that? And yet our teachers have to deal with this each and every day. So I'm not going to go through the details of the report. Anyone who would like, you are welcome to download it from our website. But I am looking forward to a discussion with three people who, each in their own way, faces this issue much more directly and much more frequently than I, and we will hear what they have to say. So first of all, I'm on my left, on your right, I'm going to introduce Linda Graham. Linda has flown down from Queensland tonight to be with us, and so thank you very much for taking that time, where she is the Associate Professor in the School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education at the Queensland University of Technology. Her research focuses on how some of the organisations and some of the institutional elements affect disruptive behaviour, and particularly I understand you look at some of the harder core end of this. And so you've probably seen what can happen when things are not caught early.
Yeah, definitely.
Linda put in her bio that she can often be found on Twitter at Dr. Linda Graham, and certainly I can attest to that. We've had a number of very good Twitter conversations. Whilst I'm on that, you can follow the conversation and join in at Grattan Institute and #PolicyPitch, and those are up there. So in Linda, we have someone who has spent many years understanding this from a research perspective. Next to Linda, we have Jerome, who has been living this. He is an English and English as additional language teacher and humanities at Keysborough College in South Springvale. He's in his 5th year of teaching, so fresh enough to remember some of the challenges of the first year or two, but now in a position where I understand, Jerome, that you are helping others to figure out how to improve their teaching, including how to build engagement. So I suspect there might be some quite fresh lessons in there that we can all benefit from hearing. And then furthest along, we have Irene Iliadis, who is the principal at Hume Central Secondary College. She has over 30 years of experience in leadership and in education, and 20 years in leadership roles. I spent, when I was doing this report, I spent a day in the back of classrooms in Irene's school, and what I saw was fascinating, both the proactive way that the school was talking about it, but also some of the real life challenges. And as a principal, Linda has to not deal with them on a day-to-day basis, but help others deal with them. So we have a researcher, a relatively new teacher, and someone who leads teachers to provide us insight into this topic. That's it from the speech from me. I will pose questions, I'll jump in occasionally. We'll spend about the next 40 minutes or so having a discussion with the panel about different elements of this topic, and then I will throw open to audience questions. So start thinking about the questions that you want to ask. But with that introduction, I'm going to start with Linda and just try and understand what is happening in Australia's classrooms. What does the data show?
That's a very big question. Thanks, Pete. Well, look, in the report you talk about a number of different studies that have been done, and the one that I know best is by Anna Sullivan, or led by Anna Sullivan in South Australia, and in that they surveyed 1,750 teachers in South Australia, and I think one of the most important things, what I really appreciated out of that research, was that it didn't confirm what you see on the front page of the Daily Telegraph or the Courier Mail. The discourse out there is that behaviour is completely out of control and that kids are throwing chairs across the room and all that sort of stuff. That does happen, but it's relatively infrequent. But what she did point to was, I think, the wearing down of the kinds of behaviours that teachers find most difficult, which is things like, talking out of turn, and my actual favourite, which is not doing work. I find that actually really fascinating, because I think you have to try and get into the headspace of the kid who's actually doing that. And one of the things that I think teachers find most difficult is that is something that you cannot actually make a child learn. And that is something that they can withhold. So for me, that's always the most, and that's where engagement comes into it, which is, well, okay, so how do we lure them into this process? And I don't think that it is just boredom. I thought that when I started my research career a long time ago. I thought that, but there's lots of different types of disengaged kids, and you would know that. You have them in your class. The ones that I'm particularly interested in, and the ones that I think we can do something most quickly about, are the ones who are built over time, and they're the ones who begin school with learning difficulties that remain unaddressed through school, and then they become major problems later on. Does that answer your question?
I think that answers it a good deal. Tease out a little more. What does the evidence say about this interaction between learning and engagement? I remember when I was working in Cape York, someone told me that 80% of behaviour problems can go away if instruction is at the right level and appropriately engaging and the students can succeed at it. But is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, look, I mean, everything, there's an element of truth. There's an element of truth in everything. I do think that there is a problem when the curriculum is pitched too high. So we do need to differentiate, obviously, for certain kids. But, speaking of that issue of engagement, we were talking about that this morning at QUT. And one of the things that I find most interesting is that people don't necessarily look at the research on engagement. And, we talk about it being a multidimensional construct. And that's because there are a number of different things that are feeding into it and a number of different things that are essential. And a lot of the time we're just looking at social and behavioural engagement, and we're not thinking about intellectual engagement. And to me, I think that's the most important part, because, what's the point? I feel, intellectual engagement is necessary to learn, right? But a lot of the time we're just focusing on whether someone is, on task, whether they are being compliant. And so that's how you have this kind of, of that 40%, there's quite a lot of kids who are floating under the radar. They're not actually learning, but because they're not a problem, we don't notice them as much. So, and one of the things that I feel really strongly about is that for intellectual engagement to happen, you need the curriculum to be right, you need the pedagogy to be right, and the teacher, that's their role most of all, is that they need to be the ones to be an intellectual leader, to lift that kid from here up to there. So.
And one last question on the research evidence. So we have some kids who are passively just not doing the work, some who are playing out. What's the impact on their learning?
Well, they're not learning very much. So, we've already had studies around that have looked within classrooms that there is a great spread in terms of the capacity of students, which makes it also incredibly difficult for teachers, because they have to teach across that spread. But if they're not engaging in class, then that contributes to gaps over time. And then, so where my interest is in the kids who they're not the ones who are sitting there silently failing. I'm interested in the ones who end up throwing chairs across the room, because they're the ones that end up out of school and all that sort of stuff. And I do think that we can do much more than we currently are at recognising what it is that all of these kids are reacting to. what is it about their learning? Like, why don't we ask them in terms of, do they enjoy what they're learning? Do they think it's relevant? I mean, it was interesting, my son the other day, he's in year 10, and he said, Mum, in maths, what we did today, only one person in that room, I reckon, is ever going to use what we did. And my response to him was, that's great, darling, but, in 10 years' time, it's going to be only that one kid who has a job. So, you need to learn this. But, so there is that kind of disconnect that kids, I think, and we're not doing well enough at the moment at bridging that gap between what they think is relevant, what they enjoy, and what we think they have to learn.
Thank you. And so that gives some flavour of the complexity of this area. Some flavour of the number of things that we still don't know about. There are a number of things that we do know, some things that work. But Jerome, think back to the first year that you were in the classroom. I'll then allow you to talk about how you've evolved. But in the first year, what did this feel like when suddenly it was your job to be leading that classroom?
I can still remember my first lesson, and it was a positive one for the most part. I started out doing quite a bit of team teaching, so we had larger groups of students with 2 or 3 teachers at one time, and that was a really positive learning experience for me because I could look at others and what they were doing, and then reflect on my own practice and seek feedback and so on. So that was really good. But I mean, it is one of the most difficult and daunting things to be thrown in front of a room of 25 teenagers that all have their own agendas and hormones kind of, going all over the place. And, we're in conversations with parents every day asking them how they're telling us that they can't control them at home and discipline them at home. So, we're getting a lot of that coming back into the classroom. But for me, my first year was scary, and I worked so hard to, try and make all my lessons interesting and engaging. But it was really about building my connections with staff and students, and about sort of just focusing on one small step at a time and slowly kind of growing and improving my practice until I had a good culture of learning where the students felt respected and, I was kind to them and I was able to deal with issues in a reflective way, which helped them grow and develop as young people. So,
could you give us an example of that when you had a challenge, but actually you found the way to re-engage rather than butting heads?
Definitely. One example is when a student is off task or expressing this sort of disengagement that we're talking about, whether that's, annoying someone in the class or actively, or just, kind of refusing to do the work. My first question is, are you okay? So I walk over to the student and I ask them, is everything okay? Is there something wrong? And probably most of the time they go, oh, no, I'm fine. And they pick up their pen, and they're less likely to want to engage in a conversation about their well-being. So they jump straight back into, the questions or the, short answer that I'm asking, the task that I'm asking them to do. So it's not always as pretty or as easy as that. So I spent period 2 today sitting next to one of our most challenging students in year 9 that's got a whole lot of, so much going on. And I just had to sit next to her and keep directing, like, bit by bit, bits of feedback, going around the class and then coming back to her because she was just trying to derail, so much that was happening. And even that, it's testing me even after 5 years and feeling like I, am pretty good at it, because it's just kind of, you're trying to balance that intense kind of, I don't know, there's so much going on, and you're trying to really motivate a young person to want to learn and have the reason to learn and the ability to learn. So I guess that's the beauty in teaching, and that's why it's so exciting every day, and that's why sometimes we cry. because it's so hard. But yeah, so far so good.
And one last question on that. What's going through your head when you're both intensely focused on this young person who absolutely needs you to help provide them some hope, some support, an experience hopefully of getting something done and achieving something, and then knowing that you've got 20 other kids in the class and that they also have needs from you as a teacher? How do you think about that?
Yeah, sometimes you need to put out the spot fires in order to make sure that the rest of the students can just be focused and on task. And sometimes you need to tactically ignore the student that is shouting out for attention and then, ask the other students also to ignore them while you just continue with the lesson. And if they're not getting what they want out of you, they will quite quickly change sort of track. So But that's when your school support and the sort of the behaviour management plans and so on come into place. Because if the student continues to, disengage and is disruptive to the point where they're not following instructions, then we call for support. So I would call for the junior AP or even the principal sometimes to come in and remove that student. And often that's me. But sometimes it's someone else as well. So just having that support and structure in place, to make sure that you can look after the learning needs of everyone else as well.
Thank you, and hold the rest of the thoughts on the other tips, tricks, techniques, etc. Because I'm going to jump to Irene now. So this gives hopefully a bit of a flavour of both what's happening on the macro scale, what the evidence is, what the nature of the challenge is, but what it feels like. I mean, I'm in awe of someone who can go through that and say, and this is the excitement of teaching. That's just fantastic. But Irene, in terms of how to create a better learning environment, you've been through this and done it in your own classrooms, but now you're not in every classroom. You're trying to set up a school where this is happening at scale, in a school that is in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, where some of the kids come from backgrounds where education would be highly valued and some maybe not so much. How do you think about the challenge of setting up an environment that is going to give every kid that best chance every day?
Look, I think I might just start because I'm sort of envious of the last two speakers, but unlike Jerome, I don't remember my first, but I definitely remember my worst class, and unlike Linda, I went in thinking I can make you do whatever I want you to do because I decided I was going to be a teacher very young, and so here's my chance. And, of course, my year 7 or 8s, whoever they were, didn't agree with me. And I set the task, and of course they did everything but the work I set them. I think it was my first year. And I thought, okay, guys, it's lunchtime, no one leaves. And I stood at the door until you've done it. And I stood there until the first kid went out the window. So, I realised that I had to find, think and search deeply within me to find strategies that were going to be much more effective than my belief for what was going to happen and my will to drive all the young people to do as I wanted to do. But, since then, and it's been quite a number of years, but I still remember it, teaching and, being, whether you're at work currently and you've got someone coming new into the office, whether it's one person, lots of people, it's complex. It's about giving something, but also the other person being ready to take it. But my overall belief is that young people, like all of us, when we come for an opportunity to learn and grow, we have to, at some level, even though we don't articulate it, we ask ourselves, what's in it for me? What's the purpose here? What have I got? Why do I want this? And I'm not saying that we're always aware of that, but that's an important thing to remember. And secondly, who around here, if I should need it, is going to help me to succeed? And if I'm not sure, then I'm out. And of course, I've got to be at school. Mum says that and Dad says that. But I'm going to make it pretty difficult and I'm going to have fun. And it's not necessarily going to be on task. And because over the many years that I have been teaching, it has been in schools where, you know, students, I think, have aspirations, but they don't necessarily have the models. So if you go into a middle-class school, you know, young people from very young have been exposed to all sorts of experiences. So they've done learning, they are confident in different environments, have seen models, mum and dad speak on the phone with people, use language that they obviously understand. And so in some of your middle class schools, you mightn't get the extreme behaviours because they know it wouldn't quite be right. And most kids get it. And so everyone would look at me and think, what are you up to? But if you haven't had those models, you still have all the feelings of wanting something for yourself. But how that pans out is more of a challenge for the young person because they haven't got as many experiences, but also for the people who are leading the classroom, the environment. Having said that, I think that an important part in that learning context for any teacher, and I think others have mentioned it as well, the challenge is for all of us, in order to learn, you know, we're vulnerable. You know, if we're doing what we do well, we're doing it. But if we're in a situation, and some of you might have tried to ski, Lord forbid I have and regretted it, you know, you're really vulnerable because your skills are going to be challenged and you're not alone at home playing on the internet. You're there with another 20, 25 young people and they're adolescents and they're cruel. And they are cruel. They laugh at anything and everything. And so, you know, to actually do it, then you're only going to do it in an environment that is safe, it's predictable, and you're going to be supported. Now that sounds really easy, but you've got 25 individuals who will be completely, each one will be 2 or 3 people given the right context. You know, so you can't predict, so it's like having 115 there any given time because of the demands. So the challenge is huge. It's doable though, I think. You know, it sort of sounds that way, but I think if, you know, and the ingredient is that, you know, you're a culture, you're an organisation, you're not just a single person. And if you're a great teacher in a bad school, you're done for. And, you know, if you're not such a great teacher but in a good school, then you're pretty safe. And when I say good or bad school, I mean I'm talking about a culture. Because in all schools, I think teachers that decide to be a teacher, they haven't, because I'm going to go and make adolescents miserable, or prep is miserable. I think you go in there because you feel you're going to support others to learn and thrive. But I think it's a culture of a school is quite difficult to make happen. And in my experience, you know, a good culture is when the majority of teachers are behaving like good teachers. Yep. And they feel supported by an organisation that is going to support them. When you have that, increasingly so, and people know that it's not just my show, it's our show, then we're likely to be collegiate, we're likely to be sending key messages together, and it's a bit like a household. If mum and dad are in unison, kids are more likely to toe the line, and when things go wrong, there's a greater chance that things are going to come back to where they need to be quicker rather than longer. So, you know, and I think that often in all schools, in part of that culture, you get what you expect. And so as a leader, you've got to create high expectations. And if somebody walks into a classroom, this lecture, and they come in and they are clear about what they want to do, with a belief that you will listen to them and they will have something to offer, then it's very rare that kids don't respond to that. And they'll try you out for the first week, maybe month, but when they know that you're there for them, that you've actually prepared, you mightn't be perfect, but you're yourself, you're there consistently prepared for them and to engage them, then I think that, and I'm talking about not an individual, but a climate in which teachers are that way inclined, then you do maximise learning.
Thank you. And within there, when you talk about having high expectations and a consistent climate, culture and predictability, one of the things that I saw in your school was that during the week that I was there was one particular element of behaviour that the school was focusing on. I forget which one it was. But it picks up, I think, on that idea that not all kids actually know how to behave. This one might have been, what does it look like when you're working in a small group? But you had really formalised that process so that everyone focused on it, and the teachers got good at that specific piece, the students understood it. What was the thinking behind that, and what impact has that approach had of being very specific about an element of culture, not the broad bit, which is sometimes nebulous?
One of the context for Hume Central was a regeneration project in Broadmeadows, and lots of things needed to change, but the culture was to increase the expectations and expect things and change the attitudes that young people had about themselves. And years ago when I went as an assistant principal, just as a quick example, there were teachers that were walking around with tubs, and in those tubs were bits of paper or books that they brought for the kids, because if you left it up to the kids, they would never bring the equipment, and so forget about trying to, send them backwards and forwards from lockers. So the teachers carried them. So the kids had no responsibility. And, we're in a situation now where that never happens. Nobody carries any books except, the student. We had maybe, if we were lucky, attendance that maybe 60% of the time kids were there. Now we consistently have closer to 90, consistently 7 to 12. We had about 20% of kids, if at all, finished year 12 would go to university or even tertiary like TAFE. Now we have 98% of kids that finish year 12 get a tertiary placement, and 60% of those are at university. It's not all academic, but it's important. And a lot of that was the expectation. Now, we got a lot of traction. We had, classes were relatively humming. There was a lot of cooperation with staff, but we also felt that with behaviour, as this was going back maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that our exits from class, when there was, give kids opportunities, you still had to go through the process of exiting and saying, you've lost your right to be here, in a very calm and adult way, but nonetheless exclusion, I guess. Then there were suspensions and there were expulsions, and we felt whilst we were still, we had made huge inroads, it wasn't quite where we needed it to be. We always had an approach that, you look to research, you see what it says, you say, well, what does it mean for us? How do we roll it out? Where do we begin? How do we make it everyone's business rather than a good idea in one class? And we came across yet another evidence base which said school-wide positive behaviour approach to teaching behaviour. And in essence, I'm not going to tell you the whole bit, but it says that the school has to have clear, maybe 3 goals, what they are, be clear about what do they look like in all the spaces, in learning, in the corridors, out in the community. Engage the community, the kids, your staff, decide on what they are, crystallise, and then you make it part of your role as a teacher to explicitly teach aspects of it. And they drew a comparison which sort of stuck with me, and that is that if a child in your class can't read or write and they stumble on a word, you don't turf them out of the class, do you? You spend time teaching them. However, when someone demonstrates a behaviour that's not what it needs to be, they're out. So at what point are you providing opportunities for young people to learn in that regard and to be really clear about what you're expecting and why you're expecting it? So in doing that as a whole school, we thought, well, what does it mean? We had to engage kids. So some of our staff, if we're talking about the way to wear uniform, there are a few media teachers who decided to ham it up a bit and grab a few kids, and they did a bit of a parade, and they filmed it in terms of, looking good, and this is the uniform, and, and had a bit of fun. And it was shown to young people. So you engaged them with a range of all the behaviours that you had in your matrix, and you did this. And we talked about ways of making every teacher's business. How do we roll it out at year 7? And we trialled it, and now it's a 7 to 12. The matrix is at 7 to 12. We sort of ways of making it relevant for the whole college, so that on a given 3-week cycle, there are particular behaviours that are the focus. And so, when you might say at the start of the lesson when you're going to do a little bit of group work, you might say, look, one of the focus of behaviours that we're honing in on today will be this, because we're doing group work. And so listening to each other and respecting others' opinions might be something I'll be looking out for. And the idea is that you look for that behaviour, the positive, not the negative, and that you're rewarded in some way and you acknowledge it for kids. And it sort of educated all of us in doing what we do best, or what we want to do best, and that is focus on what the good stuff that's happening rather than punishing the not so good stuff. And over the last couple of years, we've had maybe 50% reduction in suspensions and exits from class. And for a number of years, other than last year, we had 10 to 12 expulsions a year, which is a lot. And last year we had none at the senior campus, no expulsions, and just 2 on the junior campuses for extreme behaviour. So, that sort of changed what was happening in the class, and the feel became very different as well.
Thank you. That's a tremendous story, and really important to understand that real change doesn't come about by accident or by good intention. But by real action, thoughtfulness, planning, focus. Jerome, back to you. I don't know if that broad approach resonates. If so, or if not, what does it take to go from here's what the school as a whole is doing to how to translate it into the classroom? What are the things that really make a difference day to day, class to class?
I think that behaviour management, or the idea of managing sort of a class, when I started my teaching program, it has a lot of mystique surrounding it. And then there isn't actually a lot of practical training in universities as to, what the steps are to follow, in a classroom in order to deal with difficult behaviours and disengaged students. And I've reached the point now, I guess, where we're looking at, updating our kind of behaviour management rubric, or our sort of step-by-step process, and, revamping it a bit in the leadership teams. But like there are kind of really, I would say, simple steps that you can do that enable students to feel respected and given choices. Where the bad choice is actually the worst option for them. So they tend to choose the best, and it's only when they're extremely dysregulated where they're going to kind of step out of line and exhibit some of the extreme behaviours that were spoken about.
So that's in terms of some of the reactive stuff, and the evidence base that we found very much picks up on both of those, that you need to reinforce effective behaviours and then have consistent responses when kids break out of line. The high expectations is very much part of it, the relationships. What about routines in a classroom? How important is that? What do you do? What have you seen that can head some of these things off at the pass?
Routines are absolutely essential in a good classroom. We have a school-wide approach to our lesson plan, a lesson framework. It goes by the acronym of GNAG. But basically it starts out with learning goals and the tasks that the students will be doing, and then that you give them new information and then a chance to apply that new information to a task, and then you reflect on it at the end. So I've seen so many different kind of lesson plan pro formas, and they all follow a similar structure, that the students know why they're learning, they know what they're going to do, they know what's expected of them, and then they've got a chance to apply that, and then they reflect on it at the end. And when I first heard about it, I was kind of like, oh, but I know how to do my lessons, and this sounds kind of stupid. Because sometimes it's fun to just do this or that, or, like when you start out, you have a lot of crazy ideas that completely fail, and a few that work. So I have come back to it, and I find it really helpful, because you just, the way you think is the kind of learning path of your student for that lesson. And you go, okay, this is a skill I want to focus on, and this is how I step through it. And then you're constantly kind of communicating with your students and giving them feedback and kind of pointers, and if they're off task, you're giving them opportunities to correct their behaviour and so on. So I don't yell, I don't raise my voice. I speak very firmly and clearly, and sometimes, with a bit of, I guess I can't help that emotions come through. But it's always about giving students choices and the ability to self-regulate until the next choice will be, look, if you keep doing this, I'm going to have to call your parents and going to bring them in for a meeting. And if you want that, if that's what you want to happen, then that's your choice and we can do that. And then I'll walk away and give them a minute to think about it. And, look, 9 times out of 10, they make that positive choice. And I wasn't taught this at teacher school, this explicitly, and I didn't see examples of it. And I think it would be hugely beneficial for teacher training just to have some videos of how to kind of approach some of these difficult situations.
So it's a good opportunity, Linda. You look as though you're itching to jump in, but what do really effective schools do differently, or whatever else you want to jump in on?
Well, I just want to make a comment about teacher training, or teacher education as we call it. There's some difference around the country, but so the teacher education program that you went through was a little bit different. So it wasn't like a 4-year Bachelor of Education or a 2-year Master of Teaching like you would do at, say, QUT or whatever. And there is, I think, some diversity in the quality of what is offered, and some universities have got people who are teaching behaviour management who have never really been in that role themselves. Not my university. At our university, it's taught by someone who has been doing it for 25 years, and who is her job before she came to QUT was as a itinerant behaviour support person at a regional level. So there is diversity out there, and one of the things that she does teach, I've lectured in her unit, and one of the things that she does teach is about routines, about lining up, about all of those sorts of things. But the other point that I would make is that behaviour management isn't everything, and I think sometimes this sort of discussion becomes bogged down in how do you get the buggers to behave, but that's not all it is. And then also sometimes, so in the research that I do, so I've got 2 projects at the moment. One of them is a longitudinal project that's following kids from prep, which is the first year of school in Queensland, through to the end of grade 5. And what I want to understand is, so we did a whole bunch of assessments with these kids to work out what they brought to school. And then we want to watch what's happening. So we're assessing these kids every year. We're doing classroom observations using a standardised tool from the US every single year. We're interviewing teachers. It's a massive project. And one of the things that we're trying to unpack is how does very severely disruptive behaviour, how does that develop? And I have to say that in the observations that we do, we watch multiple contributions to that. And it's, so the other thing that we watch is that teachers can actually be quite good at the technical components of behaviour management. And it is one of the things that particularly early career teachers, they're putting their hands up for PD, and they're getting a lot of PD in that sort of area. But there are other things that can derail that. So your technical competency is only one part. Some of the things that can derail it is if you are an extremely hostile, critical person, and create conflict within your classroom. So that can be one of the issues, and that is something that we are watching. And I'm very glad to say that it's a small minority, but it is happening, and we watched it in a prep classroom. Some of the other things that can happen is when there's a lack of productivity, if kids are sitting and waiting for things to occur, if the teacher is not well prepared, you know, and the kids, we watched it last year when they're in grade 3. They're in grade 3 now, so last year they were in grade 2. And it was excruciating to sit and watch as these kids are getting in trouble, but they've been sitting on the carpet for 30 minutes with nothing happening. So, you know, we all have to look at behaviour and engagement in learning as something that, you know, it is a complex issue, and it's not just kids that contribute to it. There's curriculum, and this is a policy pitch, so I'm going to make one right now, which is another thing that contributes to it is the residualisation of schooling. So in another project that I've done, which has been with some, like the really hardcore kids who end up in special schools for kids with disruptive behaviour, right? Those kids, we went into their feeder schools, and their feeder schools were, in the main, very residualised. So they were the last stop government school that had been, like, you know, anyone who could get out did get out. And, you know, I was horrified when I went to these suburbs in, you know, Western Sydney, out of Western Sydney, and was astonished at, you know, the schools that used to have 1,000 kids in them now have 300. And these are all extremely high needs kids. But then we also have other practices that are occurring at the school level, which is choices being made by leadership, which is, let's put all of the high needs kids into one class. And of course that teacher is going to crack, you know? And then there's contract teachers put into that. That's another thing that we don't talk about enough in this country, and it makes me really cross, which is we have graduate teachers going out, and what happens to them? They're, you know, departments of education have casualised. Let's talk about that. The fact that, you know, these people don't get a full-time position, or they're very lucky if they end up in a school like Irene's, but a lot of them don't. And many of them have got short-term contracts, and they're going from place to place, or they're supply and they're being parachuted in, told to just teach something, you know, for that day, and they've got, you know, chaos in front of them. And how are they going to learn quality skills that way? Where's the support for them? Where's the induction that you talk about? You mentioned that 40% of teachers or 50% of teachers said that they had not received any kind of induction. So, you know, there's an awful lot of criticism of teacher education, but that is the first step in preparing somebody for what is an incredibly difficult, complex job. There you go.
Thank you. I've seen some of this in Cape York when I was up there. The teachers would say that a good day was when you put the video on at 12 rather than 11 in the morning. But they were able to change at least some of the behaviour thing, partly through better preparation, but also really explicitly saying, how are you going to support positive behaviour, and also how are you going to teach at a level that is going to engage the students. But that was not an individual teacher trying to sort it out on their own. That job, I think, is too hard. That's not what we should expect. Yep. Jerome, you wanted to jump in? We're moving to solutions and ideas.
I think I'm just going to tag onto that thought before I go back. I think that often I remember, Linda, you mentioned about that your son came back and said, oh, when am I going to learn this? I think, why should I learn this skill? Because it's not relevant to my world. And I think that while sort of changing the curriculum and shaping it around the moving times, or the fact that, you know, all these jobs are going to be lost and so on, I think that it can be easy to be kind of pulled down that track and forget that the main skills that students need to learn are to be able to, you know, read information, to be literate, to understand the world around them, to communicate with others, and then to think critically. And that goes, literacy and numeracy. Like, literacy is a broader concept than just reading a book, obviously.
Yeah.
But I've been in conversation with staff, talking about, how can we make this more exciting or more kind of relevant? And the relevance is one thing, but if you find a student and show them that they're growing and that they're improving, the engagement just, they click, and learning is a beautiful thing. And when you see that that student has just had like an aha moment and that has happened for them, then they're going to have twice the motivation to tackle the next problem or the next thing. And it's about positive praise and building that kind of culture. So even in kind of the most abstract mathematics, if you can get them seeing growth, then, and I've seen that in many, inspiring teachers. But
like Mr. Wu last night.
Yeah, I didn't watch that. My colleagues were telling me about it, so I'm going to have to go back to that. Yeah.
Did you have another point that you were going to jump to, and then?
I'll just pass. Yeah, I'll come to it later.
Sorry, start getting your questions ready, because we'll probably take this as the last panel comment, and then we'll throw open to the audience.
Yeah, I think as in education and like in all parts, if you do things and you tick boxes, you miss 90% of the most important bits. And, in doing, whether it's, the wide school positive behaviour or whatever it is, behaviour management policy that we have, as a leader, you've got to say this is about relationships. It's about building a relationship with young people. And, one of the challenges, I think, is, and you can't underestimate, and I don't want to get political, but even with the Gonski, you might say, well, if it's a good teacher, they can do anything anywhere. Well, that's rubbish. Yeah. In the sense of, I became aware when I had my firstborn, because I was always teaching in schools with kids with high needs, and I'd have often young people, this is going back a while, but I'd have young children, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds who couldn't read. They sometimes, not all, but there were some that hadn't worked out that this sort of movement that we made related to making meaning from something, and that it actually told me a story. Now you think, oh, rubbish, but it was true. When I first, as a graduate teacher, I had a couple of students like that in my class. And when I had my firstborn, and, what else do you do except talk about nothing? You read that to them, from, baby, like months old. And my child sat on my lap, and it was 6 months old and was doing this. And I thought, what on earth? I didn't think I had a genius. But I sort of thought exposure to resourcing is so important. I don't think I have 3 sons, and I don't think they're geniuses. But the level of exposure, I'd like to credit them as being that, but I know they're not. But it's that exposure, to resources. So to sort of say that my child, when they go to school, needs exactly the same amount of resourcing, both the teachers that teach them and my child, than a school where, in some of my experience in the past, you have children. There's nothing wrong with the child. They're not lacking in intelligence, but they've been under-resourced in a number of ways. They might have very loving families, but some of them hadn't been to the beach. They'd never left Broadmeadows or wherever I was working. And to say that school, in order to meet the needs of that young child, as well as the staff who teach them and are trying to maintain core curriculum and behaviours, you're being ridiculous to actually say that. And also when you think about any profession, whether you're talking about, doctors or whether you're talking anyone, how often would you go into a workplace and somebody briefs you, says to you, you're going to have to manage this office, there are phones, there are letters you have to write, and then closes the door and goes to a different building. It doesn't happen. You have someone who works with you, you work together, you stumble, you ask. Whereas teaching, it was believed that even though you're a novice, you close the door and whatever you do is your business. And it's not right, it's a weakness to say, how did you do that? Or, how can I learn? Come and tell me, what am I doing wrong? And it's, society's changing. We no longer, maybe when I was little, my parents told me to sit in a chair for whatever and listen, and I did. But how often do we tell our young children that now? And, if you have a majority of staff who are dinosaurs, as I might have been, in terms of expecting to walk in and the kids that will listen and obey everything, you need to be sophisticated in the way that you skill people, because things have changed. And, not only children, but parents. If you say to a child, sit down, they want to know why. You can't just frame it because I said so. You can, but it won't work. And even if a parent comes, they'll say, well, why didn't you explain it to him? You can't say that. You're being a bully to my child.
Right, and the goal here is not compliance.
No.
The goal here is learning.
But I think it's complex. It is funding.
Absolutely.
It's about how do you support every single teacher and give them feedback in a positive way that your approach, the way that you made them wait for 30 minutes, you've got to change that, and I'll support you. Not, you're useless, but let's try a few strategies so that behaviour. Now, unless you put resources into opening your classrooms, supporting your teachers through observation, getting them to observe other colleagues and pick up and learn from them and open it and not feel it's my problem, but how we're going to work together to solve this, whether it's yours, your problem will be mine tomorrow. So unless you resource it and support it, then you're not going to get the change with kids' expectations, community expectations, our own expectations,
Hands up for questions, and we've got some roving microphones. So what have we got? We have down here with the red jacket, then next to, and then I'll go to blue shirt.
Thank you for a very stimulating discussion. I've actually got I've got two questions. One is cultural differences in engagement. Are, for example, Singaporean children more engaged or Finnish children more engaged? And the other question is and again, it's a cultural thing about ability versus effort. The mindset, is it I'm able to do maths, or if I make a greater effort, I could do maths better?
Who wants to take those?
I only heard the first half of the question, but...
Questions being, are there cultural differences that affect engagement? And then the difference between ability and engagement and ability and effort. Thank you.
I'm happy to take the cultural difference part, mainly because I've worked with a professor from University of Helsinki, and the Finns are different. He would agree with me on that, but they have their share of So he and I both have interests in kids who drop out of school, who have behavioural disorders and all that sort of stuff. So they still have those issues, but they do have, I think, a different culture to us, and it is probably more. Look at it for a start in terms of they're more other regarding than us. In terms of they've got a very different welfare system. It's expected that you are going to pay high taxes and look after somebody else through your taxes. But I think they're also quite a lot quieter than us. That's a sweeping generalisation, but when you go over there, it's really different to Australia. It's nice though, it's very clean.
There we go.
I'd like to jump in and speak. My school is so incredibly diverse, a student population, so we've got 82% of students from non-English speaking backgrounds, and I think the last time we counted 34 different nationalities. So just to sort of, target the student group, we need to be, when I'm teaching English, I'm aware of their native languages and some of the, common mistakes that they make, and I will change things and talk about pronunciation and articulation differently. However, and you need to be extremely mindful of the traumatic experiences that some young people might have been through when you're choosing content. But a lot of teenagers adjust very fast to their surroundings, and when I came into the school, an older staff member told me a story about the Cambodian students having a lot lower expectations because it was a cultural thing and to do with the genocide and so on. So really kind of heavy stuff. And I was kind of curious, and within a month or so, I couldn't really tell the difference between the Vietnamese students who were supposedly higher expectations, or their parents, and the Cambodian who had, they were parents that loved their students and wanted the absolute best for them. And this, we had amazing students that had really rough times that shouldn't have been so great on paper. Now, the next question was about effort versus
Ability.
We teach something called the growth mindset, which some of you might have heard of, and it's a great, Carol Dweck's research. It's a great way of teaching students that intelligence is not fixed, and that effort is the key to success in life. And to use the language of process versus person praise. So, and that was in your paper, Peter, that you praise the action and the effort and the hard work rather than, oh, you're so smart or you're so intelligent. Heaps of research out there, and that's been a great inclusion into our practice at Keysborough.
And a particularly Australian thing, many of those of you who have kids might have sent them off to swimming classes and squad training, and they're not going to be Olympians, most of them. Very few are going to be Olympians, but they can get incredibly engaged in it, and one of the approaches there is the personal best. It's not about who wins always, it's about can you do better than your previous best. I'm going to take a number of questions now so we get a diversity of perspectives. So ask the question, we'll try and remember the themes. And
Sure, thank you. And thanks to the panel as well. Just to take a slightly broader look at the environment for learning, Irene, you touched on this a fair bit in your conversations. I'd be interested to know what Linda and Jerome, your thoughts are on this. Given that everything you've described today has really highlighted that teaching's an incredibly intense, high-pressure role, and we know from a lot of recent research that educator well-being is in serious decline. What more can be done to make sure that teachers educators are supported to be at their best, to get the best out of their students?
okay, so we'll hold that question up here and then down here. So,
okay, my question, is for Irene. It follows on some of the comments that you made in relation to a good teacher teaching in a difficult school has challenges, whereas an average teacher teaching in a good school will be fine. What is your advice for teachers who find themselves in the situation where they are a good teacher but they're teaching in a difficult school?
boy, that's a tricky one. I'm going to take two more questions. So here, and where are we going? We're going to there.
Yeah, yep. So just wanting to thank the panel again. And my question is around what are your thoughts on the idea of unconditional positive regard? So not just in the extreme cases of, student with traumatised experiences, but also in an everyday classroom environment where if you've got a student coming in late, instead of making the assumption that, they were lazy and they didn't want to get out of bed, to actually have a positive regard towards them and, have an understanding and maybe ask them, like you gave an example, are you okay? Was there an issue getting to school? So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. And then one more question, and then we'll try and answer en masse.
Hi. I don't know how I have to really pose these as questions, but I work as a primary school teacher, a relief teacher, but also in the juvenile justice system. So I kind of work in the, across the board. And I can just see that personal responsibility as a teacher in the way we hold ourselves is just so important to, I guess, that being reflective of how our kids respond. And then in terms of when we talk about the success of how kids are going, I'm interested in, I guess, seeing what am I saying? I'm saying that we can sometimes measure success. Say, for example, we might have kids that are just, knuckling down and working all the way through to year 12 and go on to study and things like that. But I've, worked with kids where, you ask them to actually talk about how they are as a person and they come up with nothing. Do you know what I mean? They can't tell you that they're amazing. They can't tell you that they're, awesome. So on one hand, they're kind of, school looks like they're doing well, but on another hand, they're not doing well. Do you know what I mean? So I can just see that there's that real balance of having to build the person and the being equal to building the student, like building like the knowledge, do you know what I mean, to bring all of them to what they do in life. Because I can see that down the track then there's it creates openings for them to, easily fall off the rails if, for example, their job doesn't go to plan or whatever,
Yep. So I think two themes in there, one about supporting teachers, including those who are in tough schools, and one about the feelings that we should be engendering in students, unconditional positive regard and creating a whole person, not so, I read a book recently which talked about the model student. Lovely, they might get A's all the time, but are they set up for the world? So let's start with the whole person and the unconditional positive regard. Irene?
I mean, one way of, when you look at best practice, and sometimes you have to break things down in order to understand it, and we sort of talked about behaviour as opposed to curriculum, as opposed to what people now call soft skills. Best practice, and it's taken from the best practitioners. Schools can't be everything all the time. However, the way that you set up your resources is important, and you try to skill up your teacher in that, the relationship is not disconnected from the content. It's not, effort is not disconnected from achievement. You've got to have achievement as a teacher at the back of your mind, because you don't, and you've got to credit effort to engage all learners, the top and in-betweens and everyone else. And it relates to the content of your subject, but it relates to the relationships and the interactions in the class. It relates to how you vary your pedagogy so that, I who like to talk have an opportunity, but it's also quiet sometimes for the other person who likes to not have interactions occasionally and to think more deeply and to provide opportunities. And it's about thinking in a classroom, a microcosm of the school culture and society, and providing complex possibilities both for the teacher and the student. And if you're working in Broadmeadows and many schools, I think it's not a different human being in Broadmeadows. I think that the kids are less refined in hiding what they're feeling and being appropriate. So the school that you talked about, cultural differences, in certain contexts, kids are better at masking, but beneath that, once you scratch beneath the surface, they're adolescents and they're bored, except they're not showing it because they're meant to be respectful. And they're yawning inside. So I think it's that human element, that it's not one or the other. And I think sometimes we focus more on achievement rather than effort, and sometimes we're honing in on one or the other. But in the end, as a leader, you've got to make sure that you're tinkering and that you're doing all aspects of it, and even as a teacher, sure, it's the content knowledge, it's the way that they become more sophisticated in managing young people and developing relationships. But you also have the other element that you've got to be in tune that the teacher's having a hard time because her husband's not well at the moment, or her child. And so supporting both her, but also, every other community member. So it is complex. And it's targeting as much as you can, rather than just one thing.
Just on that, so you made me think about something, Irene, that I'm becoming increasingly interested in. I just haven't quite got the time to do anything about it yet. But one of the things that, Jerome, you mentioned growth mindset, and one of the things that I think, and you mentioned unconditional positive regard, and I think one of the things that is really important that we sometimes forget to do is to put the student hat on, try and see things through their eyes. And I whenever anyone mentions growth mindset, I smile, because my kids come home and go, as in, like they don't want to hear about growth mindset. They, Walt and Wilf, and what I find, because they're not the only two adolescents that I work or am around or hear from, and I'm increasingly fascinated by the cynicism that young people have about, particularly, this push for achievement, about NAPLAN, and they openly ask, "Who's it for?" And a lot of them don't necessarily see. So, are 40% disengaged? I mean, what fascinates me about these kids is that, they might be ones who are not achieving quite, they're not coming top of the year or whatever. But that doesn't mean that they're not thinking, sentient, critical people. And so quite often they're looking at what they're being expected to learn and how, and and messages that come back from schools, which is, I mean, in my state, it's about how many OPs that school got, which is overall positions, which is like ATAR, ATARs of 100 or whatever. And the thing is, for the kids that are disengaging, they're the ones that are saying, "Who's this for?" And there's a philosopher called Nell Noddings who, back in, I think, the 90s, was doing some work around an issue that she called ethic of care. And one of the things that she distinguished was that teachers have a different, or the way that students perceive it, is that teachers have a different ethic of care than they want teachers to have. So because one of the most common things that those disengaged kids are saying is, "Oh, teachers don't care." But teachers are saying, "Hey, hell, we do care, we work really hard." But what Nell Noddings came out about started talking about was that teachers have this kind of, a long view about, "I care about you, so I want you to succeed and I want you to do this sort of stuff." Whereas the student is saying, "I want you to care about me right here and now." Like when you said, "Are you okay?" That's what they're looking for. The long view stuff is important, and we can't do without that because, we do need them to succeed and have a future. But so it's sometimes I think about putting on the hat, and unconditional positive regard is a part of that. So in one of my projects at the moment, a boy was excluded because he was late, and that led to just this crescendo of effects, and this boy ended up booted out of school, and the whole thing started because no one would give him a late note to be able to go to class. So, and instead he got in trouble for being late, but in actual fact this boy was somebody that we should be giving a high five for turning up in the first place.
I'd like to, brief. One, put more resources into disadvantaged schools, because the teachers are, more stressed, as the research said, and that's where the real need is. Two, I would say that the social and emotional needs are very important for young people, whether you teach that explicitly or implicitly in your practice. And a lot of people run away from unconditional positive regard, but I think it's quite misunderstood. It just means care and respect, basically, which I think is the cornerstone of teaching. They're my big, that's it.
There you go. For those that have been following the news today, the Coalition has announced that it's going to do Gonski 2.0. That will include a commitment to needs-based funding. The details remain to be seen, but actually maybe more money will flow to the most disadvantaged schools. And one of the things that this conversation has done is hopefully to bring to light some of the reasons why actually resources are needed, not because it's money, but because there are real challenges that need real types of support. The teachers need to be able to watch each other, learn from each other. And this has been a fascinating discussion for me. I hope that you have found it as interesting. When I wrote the report, we knew the issue of disengagement and engagement was massive. We knew that some of the things that we talked about, which broadly fit into behaviour management and classroom management, are important. They need to be there, but we knew that there was much, much more besides. And so we've learnt something about that tonight. So could I have a very, very warm round of applause for Linda, Jerome and Irene. Thank you again to the State Library and their partnership that we have. And for those that are keen to learn more about education, and in particular, what are some of the positive skills that we want to our young people to grow up with, please do look online to find the Australian Learning Lecture, which is in just over a week. I'm going to be going and I'm looking forward to it. I hope I may see some of you there, and I hope that I see you again at a future policy pitch. Thank you.